Wittgenstein's private language argument. It's one of the central pieces of his later philosophy that we see in the philosophical investigations, and it's one of the most influential bits of philosophy of language and mind from that period in the mid-20th century. The private language argument is concerned primarily with how we think and talk about our inner lives, our sensations, our mental life. But really what's going on in the argument is we're thinking about what is a language? What does it take for something to constitute a language? And what makes language meaningful in the first place? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to try to make sense of Wittgenstein's ideas and his arguments, and we're going to link those to the views of some other philosophers. Okay, so let's jump in with that right now. What does Wittgenstein mean when he starts talking about a private language? Well, what he's talking about is a language whose terms refer to private entities, that is, hidden entities, like mental events, like sensations, like, I'm feeling pain right now, or I'm feeling warm right now. Those feelings, the pain and the warm, let's suppose that I've got this language and its words refer to these events or things or whatever that I'm supposing are going on in my mind. That's what Wittgenstein is talking about when he's talking about a purely private language. And what Wittgenstein's going to try and do is argue that there couldn't be a meaningful language like that. So there just couldn't be a meaningful language that is purely private, all of whose words refer to hidden mental events. And the reason Wittgenstein's doing all this, it's not just to get clearer for us on how we meaningfully talk about our mental lives, but really what Wittgenstein's trying to do here is tell us something about the nature of language itself. Language can't be a purely private event. Language, meaning, has to be a public phenomenon. That's really the key point here. In setting up this argument against private language, Wittgenstein is trying to set himself against pretty much the whole history of philosophy. So it's a very, very common idea in the history of philosophy that the mind is this kind of private sphere that only that person, like me in my case, has access to. And then when we think about language, we're just thinking about it picking out objects or ideas or whatever in my mind. That's the rough picture that Wittgenstein's trying to argue against. So you get this kind of idea in Descartes, for instance, right? The idea that the mind is this private sphere. Descartes' cogito, I think therefore I am. Descartes then develops that thought into a theory of what it is to be a person, and basically what I am, according to Descartes, is this mind, this Cartesian substance that is essentially hidden away from view. I'm not my physical body. That doesn't really come into it at all. I am my mind, and that is something that only I can access in the first person. It's hidden from you. And then the natural view of language on that view is, well, there's all this stuff going on in my mind, and the words of the language just kind of refer to ideas in my mind. So they're getting their meaning from my thoughts, and all of that is happening in an essentially private way. So Descartes was a rationalist, but we also get similar ideas to this in the empiricists, the British empiricists, so Locke and Berkeley and Hume. So Locke talks explicitly about how words refer to, pick out ideas in the mind. Locke's philosophy is all about how our ideas work. That's kind of the central concept in Locke's philosophy. And then when he gets on to talk about language, he basically just says, well, words are like the kind of external manifestation of the private mental ideas in my mind. Okay, so I have an idea of, I don't know, something being red, so that's all kind of formed in my mind, and then the word red just picks out the idea that I have in my mind. So we've got this very explicit view in Locke of words getting their meaning by corresponding to ideas, private entities in my mind. And we get similar ideas in Berkeley. Berkeley was all about perceptions, percepts, and how really material objects out there in the world, they're just bundles of percepts in my mind or your mind or God's mind or whatever. So really words picking out chairs and tables, really they're just picking out perceptions Wittgenstein's ideas in my mind. And you get similar ideas in Hume, who talked lots about perceptions, in Mill, who talked about possibilities of experience, A.J. Ayer, who's talking about objects as constructions from experience. Really, all of this stuff is about objects in the mind, so words picking out, essentially getting their meaning from objects in the mind. We also get a similar kind of idea in the completely different tradition of American pragmatism. So William James, the great American pragmatist, a psychologist as well as a philosopher, around the turn of the 20th century, he was talking about problems in psychology, and one of the problems he identifies is that we don't really have a good language for talking about psychological events, psychological facts. He says that an ideal psychological language would be one that has a special vocabulary just for subjective facts. He says, introspective observation is what we have to rely on first and foremost, and always, to discover states of consciousness. Okay, so there William James is basically saying the only way that we can talk about our inner lives is through introspection. Okay, so that's the philosophical background against which Wittgenstein is going to try to argue. So he's going to argue against the existence, the possible existence of a private language. So let's get a bit clearer on exactly what he means by that. He says a private language is one in which the individual words refer to what can only be known to the person speaking, to his immediate private sensations. So another person cannot understand the language. And he's very much linking meaning in this putative private language with introspection. So there's this general idea that Wittgenstein doesn't like, that the way words get their meaning is by pointing to an object. So maybe we point to an object and say, I'm going to call that thing like a chair or whatever, and that's how words get their names. The psychological correlate of that is introspection. So I introspect on how I'm feeling and I think, okay, yeah, I've got this sensation. I'm going to call that toothache or whatever. That would be how words in this private language get their meaning, through introspection. Now, what Wittgenstein is going to try to argue, his conclusion is this: introspection can never lead to a definition. It can only lead to a psychological statement about the introspector. When I sort of say, here's a sensation in my mind, I'm going to call that toothache, Wittgenstein says, I'm not actually naming a sensation there. I'm not giving a word meaning. So his conclusion is going to be that introspection, it's no basis for meaning. Meaning has to be a public phenomenon. Before we go any further, I'd just like to jump in here and say, I hope you're enjoying this content. If you'd like to help me out to make more educational academic content like this, go and take a look at my Ko-Fi page and see how you can help me out. Now, as always with Wittgenstein, it's not always clear what the argument is, when he is setting up an argument, when he's giving a definition, and when he's actually giving the argument. It's all kind of bundled in together. We don't get any nice kind of, here's my premises, here's my conclusions, there's my argument, what do you think, guys? It's not that kind of thing at all. Probably what Wittgenstein is doing in giving the private language argument is giving us an argument by examples. And here's the kind of central example that he uses. So this is around paragraph 258 in the Philosophical Investigations. He gives the example of a person who has a sensation and marks down a symbol, S, in his diary, okay? And then each time he has that sensation again, he puts an S in his diary. And then the question is, has he established a meaning of that symbol, S, by linking it to the sensation that he feels? Wittgenstein then poses the following question. Suppose this person that we're talking about has a sensation and he says, oh, this is the sensation that I call S. Is he correct? Is this a meaningful use of language? Well, Wittgenstein says, in the present case, I have no criterion of correctness. Whatever is going to seem right to me is right, and that only means we can't talk about right. Paragraph 258. What does he mean there? What does he mean by a criterion of correctness? Well, it means an independent way of checking whether the person really is having that sensation or not. Are they having the sensation that they've linked up with this symbol S? But here's the problem, right? The person has written down this symbol in their diary, this symbol S, whenever it seems to them that they have this sensation. So the criterion here can only be, it seems right to them. And Wittgenstein's point here is that if the criterion for being right is just the same as the criterion for seeming right, then really that's no criterion at all, right? Because there would be no objective fact about being right or wrong. If it seems right, it is right. And that really just means there's no such thing as objectively right or wrong in this case. This kind of example is really the core of Wittgenstein's private language argument. So let's try and dig in a bit deeper and see what's really going on there. Wittgenstein links this idea of a criterion of correctness. He thinks that criterion is essential to establishing the regular use of a word and thus establishing a meaning for that word. So he links this to the idea of language being a rule-based activity. And he also links this to the idea of language being like a game, right? We're playing a game when we're communicating with each other. Wittgenstein often talks about language games. And one of his points here is that there's lots of different language games with different rules, okay? That's not the central point here. The central point is that any particular kind of language game must have its own set of rules. If there aren't rules, then we don't have the language game, and then we don't really have a language at all. So in order to talk about the meaningful use of language, we need rules. We need to establish rules there to engage in this language game. Okay, rules establish a criterion of correctness. If you have some rules, then you have some account there, you have some facts about what would be correct or incorrect in a particular case. Now, rules can be vague and they might not cover every single case. Yeah, that's all fine. But the point of the rules is to establish in the typical cases what counts as correct and what counts as incorrect. And then Wittgenstein's point is, well, let's suppose that we've established this, quote unquote rule for the private language by writing an S in our diary whenever we have the sensation. Well, that's not really a rule, because the rule is just, if it seems right to you, then it is right. If it seems like it's sensation S, then it is sensation S, and it's appropriate to use the symbol S. Okay? Whatever you think is right goes. That's not a genuine rule, says Wittgenstein. That's not a genuine criterion of correctness. So it hasn't established a genuine language game. It hasn't established a genuine meaning for this symbol. Wittgenstein then gives us another example or another argument, the beetle-in-the-box argument. So around paragraph 293 of the Philosophical Investigations. This is a famous argument in the Philosophical Investigations. Goes like this. Suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a quote-unquote beetle. No one can look into anybody else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all. Not even as a something, for the box might even be empty. Okay, so this is a pretty famous and influential argument in Wittgenstein's philosophy of language. What is going on here? Well, it's a very kind of evocative argument, it seems to me, right? We imagine all these different people and they've got this word beetle and they're all using this word beetle, but by it they only ever look at, this beetle that they supposedly have in a box that nobody else can see. And, they might well do that. This is something we could do. Wittgenstein's point is not that we couldn't do that. Wittgenstein's point is that if we suppose that this word beetle genuinely means something in this community of language users, it doesn't mean the object that we've got in the box. Everybody might have a completely different thing in their own box. And, as Wittgenstein points out, some of the people might have nothing in the box. If the word beetle means anything, it's got to be something in public use. Maybe in that language it means something like, oh, I'm now looking at what's in my box, or I'm thinking about what's in the box, or something like that. It's not the name of an object. So this beetle in the box, it's an analogy, right? The box is meant to be, your head or your mind, the kind of private bit inside the box is meant to be this idea of the Cartesian mind. Essentially what Wittgenstein's trying to say is, if we all go around using words like pain, thinking they mean some private object in the box, right, in the mind, in the head, that can't be what that word's doing, if the word has a genuine meaning in the language, if it does, then it can't be to name this hidden object. Its use, its meaning must be something else. Okay, there's some debate out there about whether this beetle-in-the-box argument, whether it's a different argument to the previous one we looked at, the guy writing down the sensation S in his diary, or whether it's just meant to kind of back up that argument. Either way, you put all this stuff together and you get this kind of pretty clear picture of where Wittgenstein's going. Words, sensation words like pain, the analogue of the word beetle in the beetle-in-the-box argument, they can't be used meaningfully to pick out private sensations. If they have a meaning at all, it's got to be to do something else. Their use has to be something else. Wittgenstein says one can divide through by the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. Even if it's nothing, the case where there's nothing in the box. That kind of doesn't matter. It cancels out. If the words have meaning, they get their meaning through some other mechanism, not by picking out this hidden object. Okay, so there's Wittgenstein's take on what sensation words don't mean. What do they mean? What do they do in the language? Well, we'll get onto that in a bit. What I really want to do now is think about what is the purpose of this private language argument? What is its philosophical import? Well, the clear idea is it's not just about the meanings of words like pain. It's got a bigger impact than that. The bigger impact is that language can't be a private affair. Language has to be a communal affair, okay? In order to set up a meaningful language, we have to do something as a community. One interpreter of Wittgenstein, Sol Kripke, in his book Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language, thinks that the conclusion of the private language argument, language has to be this communal activity, is also the solution to Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox. So I did another video about that. I'll put a link to it up here. So according to Kripke, Wittgenstein isn't giving us, the rule-following paradox and a solution, and then private language argument and a solution. Rather, he's saying, first, look, language can't be a private affair. It has to be communal. And that is the solution to the rule-following paradox. So according to Kripke, all of this stuff links together in Wittgenstein's philosophy. That's kind of controversial, so, you make your own mind up about what you think about that. I want to now discuss a few different interpretations of the private language argument, some of which seem to sort of say, really, it's not a good argument at all. So let's first of all start with A.J. Ayer's interpretation. According to him, it's centrally concerned with memory. So Ayer says the problem is that, this guy writing down S in the diary, he might make a mistake because he might not remember the sensation well, okay? And because of that, there's a problem, in establishing a meaning link between the symbol in the diary S and the sensation itself. And then Ayer has this nice argument, right? He says, well, if that's a problem for a private language, it's also going to be a problem for a public language, because just as we can privately have problems with memory, we might also have public problems with memory. I mean, just imagine that, by complete coincidence, most of the human race, or most of the English-speaking human race, has kind of collective memory problems overnight, and we kind of forget or we get confused about what the words mean. I mean, it's unlikely, but that could happen. And Ayer says, well, since that could happen, we would then, according to the private language argument, but now applied to public language, have a problem with public language. But we don't have that problem. Clearly, public language is meaningful at least some of the time. So Ayer's saying the original problem can't be a problem for private language. Wittgenstein is wrong and private languages are fine. Okay, interesting argument, but it rests on this interpretation of Wittgenstein in terms of memory. And really, that's not what Wittgenstein is trying to do. The private language argument, as Wittgenstein gives it, isn't about memory. The problem isn't that we might misremember what our sensations feel like when we try to set up a new word to talk about them. The problem is in establishing a criterion of correctness. That is the central problem, according to Wittgenstein. Okay, nothing to do with memory. A more standard interpretation is basically just the one I just gave, okay? In order to set up the meaning for a word, there has to be a criterion of correctness associated with it that gets transmitted in the community of people who use that word. You can't have a criterion of correctness if it's just one person being both the user and the judge of that term, because then essentially we're back to the situation where whatever seems right to them is right, and that just means there's no genuine criterion there at all, okay? So on this standard interpretation, what's required to set up meaning in a language is a community of language users who share that criteria of correctness. A language needs public criteria for its use. And I guess this is why Kripke thinks that this take on private language, language needing public criteria for its use, links into the rule-following paradox, because he thinks that once you've got a community with criteria for use, that essentially gets you around the rule-following paradox. There's another slightly weaker interpretation of the private language argument due to Mary McGinn in her book on Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. And according to Mary McGinn's interpretation, basically all that Wittgenstein's saying is that introspection alone can't set up a meaningful language. So on that interpretation, he's not ruling out any language being meaningful when it talks about private sensations. It's just that we can't do that through introspection alone. If we have other means of getting language to pick out or refer to sensations, that would be fine, as long as we don't do it through just introspection. So according to her, there would have to be some linguistic techniques in place to establish words that mean sensations. Okay, so once we've got some bits of public language going, so we've got the idea of, some words, nouns, picking out particular objects, maybe then we can use those techniques, those linguistic techniques, to refer to private sensations. This view is supported in the text of the philosophical investigations. Wittgenstein talks very heavily about introspection and why that won't set up a meaning. But I think if we want to stick to the Wittgensteinian spirit of what's going on here, it's not just that we say introspection can't get a word to pick out an object in my mind. It's really that there is something illegitimate in Wittgensteinian philosophy with talking about events or objects in my mind in the first place. We shouldn't think of sensations as anything like an object. So let's dip into that Wittgensteinian idea in a little bit more detail. We've said that according to Wittgenstein, sensation words like pain, they shouldn't be thought of as picking out private objects, with a meaning given through introspection. So what do words like that mean according to Wittgenstein? What is the meaning of sensation language? Wittgenstein has a really unusual and interesting idea here. He says that a sentence like "I'm in pain" replaces the natural expression of pain. Okay, what's that? Well, the natural expression of pain is going, ah, right? Someone stands on your foot and you go, yeah. And really, when we get more sophisticated with language and we say, I've got a pain, or we go along to the doctor and we describe it in loads of detail, really all we're doing is a more sophisticated and socially acceptable way of just going, ah. And nobody would confuse my going, ah, with me trying to name a private object, okay? The grammar of isn't the grammar of, oh, I have a MacBook here, or I have a cup of tea here. It's not a kind of, here's a name, here's a word that picks out an object and then attributes ownership of that object to me. I have a cup of tea, it belongs to me. That's not what we're doing when we're saying, I have a pain. And Wittgenstein thinks that whole grammar there, I have a pain, is really misleading. It would be much more philosophically realistic to say, I'm in pain, or there is pain from my point of view. And really, from my point of view, there is pain. That just means, it's an expression of pain. I think the key point there is that when I feel pain and maybe I go, I'm not trying to describe myself to you. I'm not trying to describe my inner life. I might be, or you might get an idea of what it's like, in that instant to be me. But that's not really what I'm doing. I'm just expressing pain. I'm not describing it, okay? So the difference between saying, I have this cup on my desk here, I'm describing the world to you. Whereas if I say, I'm in pain, I'm really just expressing a feeling. expressing, not describing. Expressing and describing, they have different linguistic, different grammatical functions according to Wittgenstein, different uses in the language game, so different meanings. One of the really interesting upshots of this way of thinking about sensation language, not as referring to private objects, but as really just expressing a way of being, is how it relates to the problem of other minds. The problem of other minds is basically, how do I know that you have a mind, that you feel things in roughly the way that I do? Okay, how can I be sure that you're not just a kind of a robot, an automaton, right? How do I know that you've got a mind? And really what sets up this problem as being a really difficult one, perhaps insolvable, is this Cartesian model of the mind as this private sphere of mental events, mental objects that are accessible only to me in my own case. Only I can access my thoughts and my sensations. How do I know that you've got any at all? What Wittgenstein tries to do with this is not try to give a way of showing that I can know that you've got the same kind of sensations as me. Rather, he's trying to say that really the problem doesn't make sense, because the central idea is that there are these objects, right? Sensations, and I can know about them. In my case, how can I know about them in your case? He thinks this is just a mistake. It's a grammatical mistake. We're confused here about the way the language works, the grammar of I have a pain. Oh, do I know that you have a pain? And he thinks it's a double mistake. Firstly, like we were just talking about, it's a mistake to think of I have a pain on the model of I have a cup of tea on the desk. Really, I have a pain just means I'm in pain, which just means So, there's no simple grammatical way of going from to do I know that you have It kind of doesn't make sense. But Wittgenstein also thinks there's a problem in the way that we use the word know there. And this is a really weird point I find in this bit of his argument. He says that I can say I'm in pain, that just means but it doesn't make sense to say that I know I'm in pain. I know that I've got a cup of tea on my table because I can check it, I can verify it. And also I've got a contrast case, right? I might be wrong about that. I might be hallucinating right now, whatever, or I might have, just misremembered what's on my table. So it makes perfect sense to say, I know there's a cup of tea on the table because we know what it would mean for me not to know that. But in the case of sensations, Wittgenstein says it just doesn't make sense to say, I know that I'm in pain. The only thing it really makes sense to say is, or, that sensation has gone now. No more. There's no contrast between knowing and not knowing other than just, and not, If knowing in my own case doesn't make sense to talk about me knowing that I'm in pain, that I'm having a pain, then the whole kind of question of other minds, knowing that you're in pain, doesn't really make sense. Okay, like I said, I find this a really weird bit of Wittgenstein's philosophy. I can get on board with the idea that when we're talking about mental events, when we're using sensation language, maybe they have a different function from the function of words like, cup of tea. There's a cup of tea. The word refers to the object and I can talk about it sitting on my table and I know it's there and all that kind of business. I can see that sensation words might have a different function to that. But, saying that it doesn't make sense to know that I'm in pain, so in these kind of examples, Wittgenstein emphasizes the natural expression of pain or pain behavior. Someone treads on your foot and you go, And Wittgenstein is saying, think of the meaning of the word pain not as referring to some object in here, but rather think of it as associated with an expression like, the behaviour of pain. And that has led some people to interpret Wittgenstein as giving us a kind of behaviourism. Behaviourism is a theory of the mind, or more specifically of mental language used to describe the mind in terms of behaviour. It's the theory, at least in philosophy, that says the meaning of a word like pain is given by a set of dispositions to act, like, the disposition that if you tread on my foot, I'll go, and try and do things to avoid you treading on my foot in the future, stop you doing that or whatever. That's the meaning of the word pain according to a behaviourist. And, Wittgenstein does say some things that kind of mesh with this fairly well, so is Wittgenstein a behaviourist? Most interpreters of Wittgenstein will say that he's not a behaviourist, right? He's not a serious signed-up card-carrying behaviourist. He does say some things that mesh with behaviourism, like don't think of the meaning of the word pain as referring to, an object or an event in your head. Think of the meaning as something like replacing the natural expression, like the behaviour. I think it's actually really hard to pin down Wittgenstein on a particular theory. Is he, isn't he a behaviourist? And one reason is a lot of the stuff he says just isn't that clear. Okay, so, you're thinking, okay, so pain, it's not a private event. What is it? Well, he says, 304, pain is not a something, but it's not a nothing either. Saying things like that don't really help make your philosophy clearer or easier to understand. And there's a lot of stuff in this bit of the philosophical investigations that I think is just really, really murky. Nevertheless, the main ideas behind the private language argument and its main conclusions are pretty clear. You couldn't have a private language, a language who gets its meaning through introspection, picking out private terms, okay? According to Wittgenstein, you just couldn't have a meaningful language like that. And the big conclusion for the nature of language in general is language, to be meaningful, has to be a social, communal activity. I think that's a really, really important idea in philosophy of language, and it's been really, really influential. I don't always agree with every bit of Wittgenstein's philosophy, but I always find it interesting. I think it is some of the most rewarding philosophy to read and learn about. So if you want to dig deeper into other bits of Wittgenstein's philosophy, go and check out this playlist here. If you've got any questions on this, leave me a comment down below. I try to respond to all of them. Thank you so much to my Ko-Fi supporters for making this content possible, and thank you to you for watching this far. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you back here soon.